Welcome back to Scruffy Tales. I'm Scruffy, and this is the War Zone. And in this video, we will be taking a look at some horrendous casualty figures for Russia, and also exploring a bit the tactics that Ukraine is relying upon to inflict these casualties on the enemy. And here we have a recent update for the map on the 14th of January 2024. Yellow dotted lines are Ukrainian supply lines leading into Avdiivka, and the red arrows are the Russian points of attack. And as you can see, you have three main pushes towards the city itself of Avdiivka, and you have a lot of attempts to try and bypass the city to cut off the vital supply lines that Ukrainians rely upon to keep the city in Ukrainian hands. So yes, if you ask me, the Russian battle plan makes perfect sense. The problem is, of course, that Ukrainians are putting up stiff resistance, especially around the small village of Stepove. So looking at some of the estimated casualties, both Russian and Ukrainian, by December 12th. Now, by this time, the offensive around Avdiivka had been ongoing for 2 months, and we are at the making of this video another month into the offensive. So even more casualties have been inflicted in this time. But by December 12th, you had some 13,000 killed or wounded Russians and some 400 destroyed Russian artillery pieces, tanks, and armored transports. Now, compare this to 2,000 killed or wounded Ukrainians and only 30 destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles. Yeah, the Russians are really getting butchered in and around Avdiivka by the Ukrainians. There's no doubt about it. And if you take a look at the cost per square mile, the Russians have to lose some 3,000 men per square mile to advance in and around Avdiivka. Just insane numbers. I mean, this is World War I all over again. But instead of charging trenches, at this point you have armored vehicles trying to push through artillery and minefields, just like we saw the Ukrainians try during the summer. So just horrific casualty rates for these battles. And like I said, yet another month has passed since these numbers came out, and nothing indicates that the situation has changed. Russia keeps pushing, keeps attacking, and Ukraine responds with artillery, they respond with armored vehicles, and they just butcher any Russian attempt to advance. And it's basically sheer volume of manpower that allows Russia to actually gain ground. It has nothing to do with fancy tactics or anything. They just keep pushing until they actually manage to grab some ground, gain territory. It's not, what when human wave attacks like they talk about in World War One. That's not what they're doing, but what they are doing, they keep sending one wave of armored assaults after the other until Ukraine can't send in enough drones or enough artillery rounds to stop them. So eventually, one or two squads will get through and manage to set up shop in a windbreak, and then Russia has gained control of that windbreak. So that's basically how it's done. They just keep sending troops until a squad or two pushes through the Ukrainian barrages. I mean, it's sheer insanity, in other words. And I'm sure you've all heard of Stepove at this point. I mean, a small village that Ukraine has held for 3 months against heavy Russian assaults. And this weekend we saw a video pop up that involved two Ukrainian Bradleys defeating a Russian T-90 main battle tank in the middle of this small village. Very intense combat footage. And this town, Stepove, is key in the defense of Avdiivka, and the Russians have just thrown bodies at this small village, and Ukraine keeps holding. They still hold this small village that is so extremely vital for the overall defense of Avdiivka. And as I'm sure most of you know, Stepove is located roughly 2 kilometers north of the coke plant, just outside of Avdiivka. And as you can see on these images, on the left one, you have satellite imagery, summertime, pre-war, as far as I can tell. And I've highlighted the corner of the town with the yellow dotted line. And if you compare it to now, war-torn Avdiivka at the beginning of winter, look at just the amount of artillery that has been used against this small town, and there's not a building that is still standing. Nothing but rubble. And even in this dystopian state, it's still so vital, and it's still a fortification, a small fortification that is absolutely crucial. And as long as Ukraine can hold Stepove, they do stand a chance of actually holding the city of Avdiivka. And now we're gonna go over briefly how Ukraine has managed to hold on for 3 months in and around Avdiivka, despite being severely outgunned, severely outnumbered. And it basically comes down to drone recon, indirect fire, and counterattack. So what usually happens is that Russian forces push out from controlled territory in an attempt to secure ground within no man's land, and moving the borders of controlled territory forward. And in order to do this, they require a bunch of vehicles, and these vehicles are spotted by Ukrainian drones quite often as they're moving around and as they are assembling for an assault. So when the Ukrainians spot a bunch of Russian vehicles moving towards an area and then linking up, Ukraine knows, okay, we got an assault coming. So they alert the artillery, and then they wait for the Russian forces to cross the wide open farmlands, and that is when they call in artillery strikes, hitting the vehicles as they are moving across open terrain without cover, where they are easy targets for artillery shells. And if the artillery is not enough to take out all the vehicles as they're crossing the open terrain, once the Russians do reach their objective, if they get that far in no man's land, Ukrainians continue to hit the Russians with mortars, with cluster munitions, and with the 25mm rounds from the chain guns of Bradleys. So as the Russians are dismounting troops and the troops are getting out of the armored vehicles, mortars, cluster munitions, and high explosives from the Bradleys rain in and just wreak havoc on the Russian infantry as they are trying to find cover in the windbreaks or whatever the terrain feature may be. And then at this point, Ukraine then sends forward usually 2 or 3 armored vehicles, usually Bradleys, and often a couple of Bradleys that are accompanied by a tank to give them fire support. And they drive up to the location where the Russians had dismounted troops, And here the Ukrainians drop off stormtroopers that then go in on foot to hunt down any surviving Russians in this area. And when there are no more Russians around, the Ukrainians get back to their vehicles, get picked up, and they head back to safe territory once more before the Russians call in artillery and mortars on their heads. So this is the Ukrainian tactics in dealing with Russian advances. And as we can see in the casualty figures, it's very effective. The artillery is the main source for Russian casualties. But any Russians that manage to push through the artillery are then faced with Bradleys and very angry Ukrainian soldiers with machine guns. But as we've seen, it's not enough to stop the Russians from taking ground. The Russians are gaining ground, but at a tremendous cost due to these Ukrainian tactics. So yes, Russia is advancing, but at a great cost. Very little gains over these 3 months. Stepova is still in Ukrainian hands. And for every Ukrainian soldier lost, Russia has lost at least 6 soldiers. So, I mean, it's just not sustainable, this battle, because Ukraine has inflicted so many casualties on the Russians that it's not sustainable at all. And for every armored vehicle that Ukraine has lost, for instance, Russia has lost 10 vital weapon systems like artillery, tanks, and armored transports. So, I mean, this is set up to be a Pyrrhic victory for Russia if the Russians actually do manage to grab Avdiivka in the end. But I mean, at what cost? And for what gains? Avdiivka is not that important on the strategic level of the war by any means. It has propaganda value, obviously, after 3 months fighting, just like Bakhmut. And, you know, it has political value, but militarily, not that much. Taking Avdiivka is not the same as had Ukraine taken Verbovo, for instance, and been able to punch through the Russian defensive lines. This is purely a propaganda battle, and Russia is not winning at all. This is a Pyrrhic victory at best, if it is even a victory for Russia at all in the end. I mean, the casualty figures here for Russia, they're, I mean, staggering, just staggering. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it all interesting, and I will see you in the next one. And as always, gå på marsch, Ukraine. Give them hell.